Hey YouTube, welcome back. Hope you're having a good week so far, wherever you're tuning in from today. And I wanted to do this video off the back of my episode last week around training mistakes and the things that you want to make sure you're doing or avoiding when it comes to your training if you're thinking about kind of muscle growth, building that kind of toned and strong physique that you might be after. Off the back of that, I got a few questions around the kind of specific muscle groups that people were really wanting to see that development in and were maybe just not seeing the kind of growth or progression that they would expect, even with some of those big rocks being in the right place. So training intensity and obviously being consistent within the gym, making sure you're eating enough, all of those bases are kind of covered, but you're still not seeing that development in any one area. And one of the most common areas that I was talking to people about last week was, it may not surprise you, the glutes. I wanted to do a video today breaking down exactly how I would be setting up my training and executing my training if glute growth was the number one goal. Firstly, just a little bit on glute anatomy. We don't need to get too bogged down in this, but I think it's important to know that it's not just one muscle. So it's not just the gluteus maximus that we may know best, right? It's actually a muscle group made up of 3 different divisions. So we have the glute max, the gluteus maximus, which is the biggest muscle as part of that group. It's the most kind of superficial one, the one that you see the most, that gives your glutes the most kind of size and shape. We then have the glute medius, which is that muscle that wraps around the upper outer side of the glutes. So this is in Instagram terms known as the shelf. Right? Shelf building exercises are usually attributed to movements that work the glute medius predominantly. And then we also have the glute minimus, which sits just underneath the glute medius. This kind of helps to stabilize and helps to work with the glute medius for most of that abduction work that we think about. So taking the leg away from the body, as well as kind of stabilizing the pelvis as well. When we think about those 3 muscle groups, really the glute max is the thing that's producing that size, that volume. And then the glute medius minimus, that's kind of adding that shape, that roundness, particularly when we think about kind of the sides and the top parts of the glutes. When we think about our glute training, we do want to be training all 3 of those muscle groups if we're thinking about getting the best overall glute development that we can get. Thinking about training frequency and how you want to split up your training in order to have that glute bias. In my experience, I would say training glutes 2 to 3 times a week is probably optimal for most people. You do not want to be going into the gym and smashing glutes 6 days a week. More doesn't mean better. But what matters less than exact frequency is overall volume. And we tend to think about volume across a week. Generally, the research is telling us anywhere between kind of 10 to 20 working sets per muscle group per week is a really good place to start. You would probably start at that lower end if you were someone who was relatively new to training. So thinking about hitting roughly 10 working hard sets of glutes across your weekly training schedule. If you're training twice a week, lower body, you're wanting to roughly make sure you've got 5 hard sets in day 1 and 5 hard sets in day 2 as that baseline. If you find as the weeks go on, you're recovering really well and crucially your intensity does not drop off, sure, you can add in a few more sets. But really things are telling us that we don't want to go much past that 30 sets per week as that high point. Usually between 10 and 20, again, works well for most people. If you're unsure about how to split that volume up or what kind of level of volume is right for you, I would honestly say start at that lower end and really work on developing your quality sessions that you can get in, the reps in every single set, making every one count, and then adding the volume as you go along. If you feel like you're recovering well, your intensity remains high, add some more in, but start at that lower end and really work on developing quality in the first instance. Once you've decided, I'm going to train glutes twice a week and I'm going to do 2 lower body days, the first thing I'd make sure is that you're not doing those back to back. You probably want at least 48 hours between session 1 and session 2 across your week when we're thinking about any muscle group that we're wanting to prioritize for growth. It needs time for recovery. If you're someone who's training 4 times a week and maybe doing lower, upper, that could work really well. Maybe you've only got time for 3 and you want to do a lower body, an upper body, and a lower body. Again, absolutely fine. Just making sure that wherever possible, you're not doing one leg day followed immediately by another leg day. Generally, that 48 hours is kind of a rough window I'll give. And then really we're wanting to talk about exercise selection. What exercises are objectively good when we think about glute growth being the main goal? There are definitely elements of this that are really individual, that can vary from person to person. But to give you some really helpful, generic principles that you should be applying, we're wanting to think about covering 4 main movement patterns in any one glute day. We want some form of squat. Now, this does not in any way need to be a barbell back squat. That is a great variation if it works for you. Personally, it's not one that I love just for my structure, my mobility, my general confidence in the movement. Is something that I will do every now and again, but I keep going back to exercises that actually just feel a lot better for me. And that really is the key. Finding movements that actually feel good. We definitely want some specific movement patterns that we will always come back to, but the variation of that pattern is going to be super individual to you. When we think about a squat, this could be a barbell back squat. It could be a front squat. It could be a Bulgarian split squat. Could be a standard split squat using a Smith machine. You could do a front foot elevated split squat, for example, to get that extra stretch at the bottom. You could do a reverse lunge. You could do a leg press. Quite literally anything where we are seeing the glutes in that lengthened, stretched position at the bottom with a degree of knee flexion too. Okay, anywhere where you're taking the hips and the knees into that type of position is going to be a good option when we're thinking about glute growth and attributing some of our glute volume to across a week. Now, any kind of squat will also train the quads. There's no getting away from that. And that is a good thing, right? We want strong quads and we want strong glutes. Don't be alarmed or confused if you are also feeling that muscle in the front of your leg working in your squat pattern. It is quite literally the function of the quads to assist with that knee extension, to straighten the knee, right? We're definitely going to be feeling some quads in that, but there is no doubt you will also be hitting that glute. One thing I would say with that squatting pattern is you can bias how much glute versus quad you feel and you work in those movements. And it's all going to depend on the angle at the knee and the angle at the hip. For example, in this particular squat pattern, you can see that I've got a really deep degree of knee flexion. And at the bottom of the movement, my knee is tracking over my toe. I also have a much more upright torso position. In this variation, with those angles, we are going to be getting a little more quad than glute. On the flip side of that, if I'm creating a little bit more of a lean at my torso and a bit of that hip flexion, and my degree of knee flexion at the bottom is not quite so deep, it's roughly that 90-degree position, my knee is roughly tracking with my toe in a perpendicular line, that is going to be more of a glute-focused squat. If you're someone who doesn't necessarily want to focus too much of their volume around their quads and would rather attribute it to the glutes, I would recommend choosing a more hip-dominant, less knee flexion type of squat when it comes to that squat pattern being ticked. We're also going to want some sort of bridge, some sort of thrust, that end range hip extension where the glutes are shortened and contracted at the top of the movement. Here we can think about quite literally any type of hip thrust or glute bridge with a barbell, with a dumbbell, single leg, B stance, however you want to do it. You could also think about a 45-degree hip extension. These are fab for glutes, and again, quite easy to load, which is great. You can use a band, you can use a heavy dumbbell, and you can also include cable kickbacks in this particular camp, because again, you're training that end range hip extension. If you think about your glutes being contracted and kind of super hard at the top, that is what we're thinking about when we're thinking about that kind of thrust, bridge, end range hip extension. We also want a hip hinge. Any kind of deadlift variation is going to be great for this. A Romanian, a conventional, a floating deadlift, a trap bar deadlift, a snatch grip Romanian deadlift, a good morning, Anything where predominantly the main thing happening is the hips are traveling back behind the body with a little knee flexion, but not much. The main joint that's moving is the hip. And again, at the bottom of this movement, the glutes are in that really lengthened and stretched position. Great for hypertrophy or muscle growth. And you also want some specific abduction work. And what we mean by abduction is we're essentially taking the leg away from the midline of the body at various different angles. So really here, we're thinking about cable abductions and we're thinking about seated abductions. We could also be doing some sort of side-lying hip abduction. We could be doing some side walks with a nice heavy band. Anything where we can take that leg away from the midline of the body is going to be really directly targeting that glute medius and glute minimus. You're also going to be getting some glute medius, glute minimus in your single leg work. So things like a single leg Romanian or a Bulgarian split squat where you're predominantly using one leg. The glute medius is going to be working really hard there to give you that stability throughout the movement. To cover all of your bases, you want 2 or 3 from each of these camps. A squat, ideally one of these squat variations should be single leg so that we're ticking that glute medius box as well. A hinge, any kind of deadlift variation, some sort of end range hip extension like a thrust, a bridge or a kickback, and some form of abduction, taking the leg away from the midline of the body. Head into the gym, try out a few of those movements, see which ones actually feel good for you. You could even just Google or ask ChatGPT, give me 5 exercises that are a squat pattern, a hinge pattern, an end range hip extension pattern, and an abduction pattern. Do a bit of testing, figure out the ones that feel good for your structure, that you feel like you can get really confident in, that you can progress in over time, and stick with those, at least for 6 to 12 weeks, aiming to get better each and every time, of course. When we're thinking about that exercise selection, of course, preference does need to come into it, but I am not for 1 second suggesting that you are going to absolutely love the idea of Bulgarian split squats every time you walk into the gym. You do have to have some of that grit, and you just need to accept that some movements you're going to love, others you're not going to love so much, but they need to be done in pursuit of the greater goal. But in all seriousness, other things to consider when we're choosing those exercises, once we've kind of put preference to one side, is exercises that you feel very stable in. Particularly when we're thinking purely from a muscle growth perspective, which in this case we are. The more stable you are, the more likely you're going to be able to actually take that exercise within that close proximity to failure. If you feel like you're actually just spending half the time hopping around, trying to get the right foot placement and feeling like you're going to fall over, it's going to be pretty unlikely that you can take that to kind of an RPE 8 or 9. Things that I personally love for that stability element is things like a Smith machine. You could do your Bulgarians on here. You could do your RDLs on here. You could do your squats on here. Because the bar is only moving up and down and it has no propensity to go forwards or backwards, you quite literally do not need to worry whatsoever about that balancing element, and it keeps you really locked in. Similarly, when we think about a leg press, a great way to get a squatting pattern under your belt without feeling like I'm going to drop the dumbbell or I'm going to fall over. You're in a seated position, you're really supported, so you can really push that one nice and close to that failure point. And really that goes for any kind of machine work, even your seated abduction. Sometimes there are standing abduction machines, all of which are literally set up to make you feel stable and so that we can isolate the muscles that we are trying to target. I'm going to level with you, even if we have absolutely smashed the element of finding the right amount of volume, and we've got our perfectly orchestrated glute day, covering all the bases, hitting all 3 muscle groups, training them through different resistance profiles at different ranges of motion. If you go in and half-ass it or don't execute correctly, then really there is no such thing as a perfect program, because it's all about execution. Just to flash back to maybe 2019 version of Emily, there was a time where I still have the notes in my notes app now about like my glute workouts that I used to do. So no shame if you currently have your workout schedules just written down in the notes app. I definitely have been there. where I would literally just not go above a certain weight on like any exercise. For some reason, deadlifts, it was 40 kilos. For some reason, hip thrusts, it was 60 kilos. I actually don't know why these numbers in my head were my ceiling. I could never go above this particular weight. Looking back, it's mad to think about how much time I wasted just doing the same shit week in, week out, but never progressing. This is really key. You have to aim to progress over time. And this is why that stability element in my mind is so important, particularly if you're a little bit newer to training and you're still working out what hard feels like, what failure actually is, what RPE is, like how do I know how many reps I had left? That is a skill. It takes time to learn, but you really do need to be tracking. Track your lifts and aim to increase. Again, when we come back to that exercise selection piece, we do want to choose things that are loadable, because progressive overload, which basically means increasing load over time, giving your body more stimulus to respond from, that principle just isn't really applicable to something like banded glute abductions or banded donkey kicks, right? How many donkey kicks are you going to do until you actually reach failure? Or is it more so that the lactic acid buildup in your glutes is going to just be really severe? You're going to feel the burn and be like, right, that's doing something great. But like, where's the ceiling? You're going to do 1,000 kickbacks until you reach that burn point? It's not particularly scalable. Once you've got to the heaviest band and you're doing more than 20 reps, you're just adding fatigue. If you like your little glute finisher at the end because you like to feel that kind of intense burn, go for it. But do all of your heavy, hard work first and choose those really loadable exercises. Make sure you're executing really well on the exercises that you've chosen. Nail your technique, keep your tempo nice and controlled, and aim to be progressing literally as often as you possibly can. As a little extra when it comes to glute development, glute growth, something that I personally find that has really changed things for me is just thinking a little bit more about mind to muscle connection. Now, I'm not saying that this is the missing ingredient to everybody's glute development, and I'm not suggesting that it has a huge impact on hypertrophy from a research standpoint, because frankly, it doesn't. But let me give you an example. I honestly think I spent maybe 3 years grabbing some dumbbells for a Bulgarian split squat, just rushing through, counting to 10, and then dropping the weights and being like, fucking hell, that was hard. But if I'm really honest, there was no way that my glutes had actually reached anywhere near failure. It was just really hard. I raced through them as quickly as I possibly could. The set was over. Again, it kind of ties into the exercise selection piece. You want to choose movements where you can physically feel that your glutes are doing the work, and that when you get to that 8th or 9th rep in your set of 10 and the reps have involuntarily started to slow down because you cannot produce the same amount of force that you could at the beginning, that is down to the glutes fatiguing, not your grip, not your heart rate, not your quads, not your lower back, your glutes. That mind to muscle connection, starting to really forge that and think about, what can I feel my glutes doing at the bottom of a lunge? I can feel that they are stretched, they are lengthened. Then when I push all the way up and through, can I feel that they're contracting to stand me back up? Am I making sure that I'm isolating all of my effort to that muscle group, rather than just thinking about, God, when is this set over? How is it only rep 6? Really narrowing your focus, thinking about the muscle that's working and focusing all of your effort there. Hopefully we've got some training volume in mind. We've got a rough training split in mind. We know roughly what exercises we're going to be choosing. We know that intensity, mind to muscle connection is all really important when it comes to taking that set of muscles close to that failure point, which, as we know, is the key for them to grow. I'm just going to touch a little bit on structures that make sense within a specific workout. And again, this is going to be quite individual. Different people will have slightly different goals. But if we think about a glute-focused lower body day, we have our exercises in mind and we're thinking, what order should I do these in? As a rule of thumb, I would always say, eat the ugly frog first, which in other words means get the really hard taxing work done at the start of your workout. If you're doing something like a heavy barbell Romanian deadlift, You don't want to be doing that as your fifth and final exercise in your lower body day, because your quality will have dropped off a cliff by then. You want to start with that. Yes, it's a hip hinge, but it's also a very taxing movement on your central nervous system in general. You're having to brace really hard with your core and your trunk in general. Your lower back is going to be working to keep you solid. Your upper body, your lats are going to be working really hard to keep that bar close to you as you lower. There is a lot happening, and it is generally quite a heavy compound lift. Start with those. Take sufficient rest. A big movement like that, you're going to be looking at a minimum of 2 minutes between sets. If you don't need every second of that 2 minutes, you're probably not lifting heavy enough. Then you could maybe move on to your single leg squat variation that you've got. Perhaps it's a Bulgarian or a split squat. Then potentially your hip thrust, which again is difficult for sure, but you're just using that one joint, that hip joint, and that one muscle group being the glutes. And then add in your accessories, which is generally going to be that abduction work that we talked about. Just think, what is the hardest movement in this workout? I'm going to do that first. What is the second hardest movement in this workout? I'm going to do that second. And then you can follow on with the things that are slightly easier, or at least require a little less mental bandwidth. And then finally, once you have that kind of structure laid out, you've got your glute days built, you're ready to go, the thing that I would say when it comes to adding volume in, if you feel like you can handle it and you need it, I would recommend that you add that in from that short range hip extension camp that we spoke about earlier. Things like your thrusts, your bridge, your kickback, simply because the glutes can handle a little more volume in that position. Lengthened and stretched movements like your squat, your leg press, your RDL, those are pretty taxing. They create a lot of fatigue. So it's much harder for the glutes to recover from that kind of work. Keep that volume in there. It is essential. There's no doubt about that. But if you're thinking about adding extra volume, take it from that shortened, contracted type camp. Again, it's easier to recover from that. It just does not accumulate quite so much fatigue. And then outside of training, honestly, the two things that I want you to make sure you're doing is not overdoing it with your overall training volume, as in trying to train glutes 6 days a week or throwing on a glute finisher to every single session that you do. Again, quality over quantity. And then the other piece is just going to be around making sure we're eating enough food. If you're trying to eat in a consistent calorie deficit, really your only hope, if you've been training a little while, is that you're going to hold on to the muscle that you already have. It is very, very difficult to build extra muscle tissue in a deficit unless you're new to training. If you're a couple of years down the track, you've been training in the gym, you've been lifting heavy, your intensity's in a good spot, you can't get away with being in a deficit and growing glutes. At least at maintenance, and aiming for 2 grams of protein per kilo of body weight. Now I've given you all the glute training secrets, I want to touch on how we can track our progress when it comes to glute growth, and also what our expectations should be. Progress tracking, progress pictures, please take them. These are honestly such a good way of capturing that physical change. We don't really care about the scales at this point because we're building muscle, right? We're at maintenance, so we don't care about what the scales say, but we do care about what we can physically see. Progress pictures, also how your clothes fit is a really good sign. Trying on jeans a few months after implementing some smart glute training could be a really good idea to kind of feel how differently things are starting to fit for you. Also some measurements. So if you have like a tape measure that you can measure the widest part of your glutes, maybe tape them once a month. And then also kind of the really clear and obvious and tangible one is performance improvement. Assuming you're not really new to the gym and you've been training for a little while, if you notice that over the space of 6 months, you've increased your hip thrust, for example, by 30 kilos, then that's a pretty good sign that if you're lifting 30 kilos more than you were 6 months ago, and that really was failure 6 months ago and it's failure now, there is more muscle on your frame that's allowing you to do that lift. That is another really good measure of progress. Now, expectation setting. The first thing I want to say is when you see influencers online, oftentimes you will see these kind of really lovely, well-developed, perky, peachy glutes. And you're like, oh my God, how did she do that? Here is the answer. It's one of two things. Either she is trained fucking hard for multiple years and has followed all of the basic muscle building principles, of which most I've laid out in this video, and stayed super consistent with that. Or genetics are playing a big role. She probably still trains really fucking hard, by the way, but when it comes to body fat distribution, women will often hold most of their body fat from kind of the navel down. A lot of the time, those kind of round, full glutes will be, an element at least, be body fat. And it just be genetically where a lot of that body fat is stored, which is why you'll often see people say things like, I've lost all my glutes in my cutting phase. Now, again, if you're doing everything right, you're still eating high protein, you're still training, it's unlikely that all of your glute loss has come from muscle, and it's more likely that dropping that body fat has led to your glutes being smaller. That's just something I wanted to kind of mention, and it might well be, if I'm completely open and transparent with you, that you will never have that big, full bubble butt look. Like, it just might not be genetically possible for you. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't try. God, I'm still here trying. I do not have the biggest glutes on earth by any stretch of the imagination, but I know I'm doing everything right, and I definitely have seen improvement in my glutes in the last couple of years. Genetically, I am very straight. I have no shape to speak of, not a curve on my body. So any shape that I have has been built, okay? But when you see some people on social media, again, with epic glutes, they probably have worked really hard for it regardless, but there is definitely a genetic element that people are underselling you. What is a good rate of progress for muscle gain in general? If you're doing absolutely everything right, you might expect, as an intermediate lifter, to be gaining roughly 1/4 kilo or 250 grams of muscle per month. And that is right at the top end of what we would expect for muscle growth. It can be as low as, say, 100 grams a month. Again, if you're doing everything right. What I'm trying to do is not dishearten you, but to set your expectations that you are not going to grow this bubble butt that you didn't have before in a matter of 3 months, particularly if you've been at this a while. A really solid year of training and nutrition might lead to 1 to 3 kilos of lean mass added across your whole body. Where you develop that muscle is largely determined by your training volume, of course, but again, unfortunately, good old genetics plays a role there. Just set those expectations around muscle mass increases and what is actually realistic and how long this shit takes. And when it comes to kind of measurements, which again might be a more accessible measure of progress, seeing as not everybody has one of those in-body scanners that you can stand on from month to month. So your measurements, you might expect 1 to 2 centimeters over the course of a year. This is a realistic target and also pretty significant in terms of actual visual appearance. So don't get discouraged if those measurements are the same for, say, 3-4 months. Instead, do it monthly, but look at the trend over 6 to 12 months. If you're combining that with your progress pictures and your strength data, then that should really help, because if you're hip thrusting 40 kilos more than you were 3 months ago and your jeans fit differently, then it's likely your glutes are growing. We just can't see it on that measurement tape just yet. I hope that's been helpful. As always, if you have any questions, please do drop them in the comments. And if glute growth is on your goals list for the rest of 2025, I currently have 2 one-to-one coaching spaces becoming available in the next few weeks as a result of long-term clients finishing up with me. I'm not doing another intake of the Recomp Blueprint until January 2026. So if you want in and you want to get to work, drop me an email with the word coaching to the address in the description and I'll be in touch. That is all for today. Oh my God, I just had a heart attack. My phone died and I genuinely thought for about 5 minutes that I had just lost that entire video. But we're good. We're good. Crisis averted. Sorry, that was so rude. Okay, that's it for this week. I really hope that was helpful and I'll see you next time. Okay, love you. Goodbye.